This is simply splendid. I'm actually in St John's Church in Duxford, a church which sadly was made redundant in the year 1870, but by a stroke of luck has allowed this building to continue very much in its original form. It dates from the 1100s, but by 1870 the church was redundant, and so no Victorian improvements were carried out inside this building. And what we're left with today is an amazingly well-preserved medieval church with original fragments of wall paintings. But the wall paintings in this building are immense and under many, many layers of paint. So if you removed a wall painting, shall we say, from the late 15th century, underneath we could have something from the 11th century. And this has been a subject of a great deal of conservation work over the years. And now, of course, the building is in the charge of the Church's Conservation Trust, and they have ploughed a considerable amount of money into this building to keep it in its original condition. Many other interesting features about this church, which we'll go through very shortly, is the fact it was also used as a village school, and there are still some benches here today heavily carved with graffiti by those early students. But on the subject of graffiti, this church is an array of amazement. There is graffiti that goes back all the way to the 15th century, carved on the walls of this church. And there are obviously references to more military aspects attached to the building. And if you wander around, you can find on the walls where people have sharpened their knives or swords. And at one point, as I can show you here on one of the arches, you can see carving lateral scratch marks on the top end of the actual archway. Now, how did these cuts get all the way up there? Well, I think here, and I don't think this is a question that's been answered by anyone previously, I think that pikemen, soldiers carrying long pikes on long staves, sharpened the axe heads against the stonework, and hence they were left with these deep scars across the arch. And with some of the graffiti here, some of it is quite amazing, some of it is beautifully carved. I'm going to show you some examples here now. You often wonder what kind of control they had over this church. Who was responsible for it? Why did they allow these people to vandalize these buildings? Let alone from the graffiti, we have the medieval wall paintings, and we have a church which for many appearances looks early 14th century, 13th century French architecture. So this is a very special place, and I'm pleased that you've joined me for this excursion today. But before we go any further, let's look at the history associated with some of the religious decorations on the walls, some of which I can say are graphically quite horrid. As you can see behind me, there are some amazing medieval wall paintings, and perhaps, shall we say, a little sinister. If you look at the drawing or painting of St Margaret with the two soldiers piercing her breast with spears or swords, this is actually a biblical reference. But to many people, when they see this, who, shall we say, are not as well versed with the teachings of Christ, would probably look at this in the modern context as being obscene. But what you must realise about the whole point of medieval wall paintings, the whole point of the Bible was to control the population and to ensure people, and we're looking at very basic peasants here who could not read nor write, to ensure that they towed the line with the church, a propaganda piece, to reinforce the control of the Catholic Church over England. And if you look at some of these pictures, particularly the demons, the suggestion here, if you do not conform to the teachings of God and to come to this church, then you are doomed and you will be sent to hell. And that basic reinforcement kept the congregation together for years. But somewhere along the way, something else has happened here. Is it because the church had become unloved and unwanted? Or is there perhaps something more sinister underneath all of this? When you wander around the church, some of the gravestones seem almost incongruous to being inside a church. There's one which is a representation of perhaps a soldier's grave or a knight's grave. There's a heavy, heavy stone over the grave on the floor of the church, and quite often people trip over it as they attempt to wander to the other side of the church from the chancel. It seems kind of odd that it's been placed directly there. And of course, the other interesting feature of this church is that you can actually see how the Christian church in England developed all the way up and after the Reformation of the church until its eventual demise in the late 19th century. The trouble with fragmentary history, and that's what we're essentially dealing with, is that you're often only left with part of the story. But even so, what still exists to this day is equally as fascinating as any other wall paintings that I've seen anywhere else in Europe, and these are quite remarkable, to say the very least. This is kind of curious for any building, and I'm actually sat behind what looks like a pew, but in fact is a school bench. And this bench is heavily covered in carvings and graffiti. One here from 1773, 1777, 1774. During the 18th century, obviously this church was not used as frequently as, say, perhaps its neighbour, St. Peter's, and so for part of its history, it was used as a village school. And perfectly preserved here today are examples of some of the carvings and graffiti left by those early schoolboys. And this bench, which probably dates, looking at the dates on here, probably dates to the 16th century, and I'm actually sat behind it. And this is amazing. This is something that you would expect to see in a museum, and here it is in St. John's Church in Duxford. And what a fascinating find. I'm actually standing at the moment with the chancel behind me, and I've actually brought with me today a K2 EMF meter. A K2 EMF meter. Now, recently, as many of you realise, I went over to Gloucestershire where I joined up with Forest Paranormal Investigations, and they made heavy use of EMF meters. And so by experiment, I brought this EMF meter with me today to see whether or not we can get a reactive contact with the lights here in this church. I'm actually feeling somebody at this moment here, a very simple soul, somebody who's disabled, a cripple. And I'm going back to the 15th, maybe 14th century. I'm not sure how the churches reacted with the poor and the crippled and the sick, but I can feel his presence here. Very plainly dressed, very raggy looking clothing, almost grey in colour. Anyway, my visit to St John's today is coming sadly to an end. We've been here for some considerable time, and of course we had to borrow the keys from the key holder, and inevitably of course they're going to panic as we've been gone for over 2 hours. So I think I'd best wrap up now. But before I do, I'm hoping that this church will provide on tape at least, and you can hear it today, some EVP or some indication of activity. I've certainly for today, I haven't felt much and I haven't seen anything. But setting that aside, this atmosphere in this beautiful building, the whole ambience of it, the history, the culture and the background to this particular church is a fascinating history. And allegedly there are associations with the Knights Templar. Certainly nearby in Duxford is a chapel dedicated by the Templars, and there is believed to have been a connection between both. This church has a very strong militaristic appeal attached to it, and it would not surprise me for one moment if the Templars had some connection with this building. And what an amazing building. And thank God perhaps, and I say this not disrespectfully, that the church became redundant in 1870. Otherwise we could be looking at a Victorian Gothic nightmare. But instead we are blessed with what the church would have looked originally without the interference of those Victorians. And on that note, I have to say it's time to go. And thank you very much for joining me on this brief excursion back to the misty past of the medieval period.